Hello, my name's Tim Barker. I'm a professor of media, technology and aesthetics in the School of Culture and Creative Arts at the University of Glasgow, and I'm also the co-director of the Digital Departures Lab. This series of interviews is based around the theme of programmable nature, and in them we explore the idea of program, a technical term and also a philosophical term, and the ecological crisis and the natural world. In this interview, I talk with the artists Tim Collins and Reiko Goto about their practice over the last 30 years and their interest in thinking about emotional and empathic exchanges with living things in the natural world.
The plein air, it's a outdoor easel, and then it's hold plant physiological equipment. They translate the data, photosynthesis and transpiration, and other environmental data such as like light, moisture, and temperature, and then they translate into 6 different kind of sounds. So the audience, they experience the activities, how active the tree is or not active, so that they experience the activities through the sound changes. Since we moved to Scotland, we started focusing on trees, single tree or many trees. So 2 activities. One is called plein air, which is artwork, and then the other one is mapping black wood. It's more like community work. But the plein air, we intend to listen to a tree. That has a kind of original episode. In 2000, we were in Duke University Forest in North Carolina, and then meeting with a scientist who has been wiring the forest and for the study of the climate change. And then so it was pine forest, and then we climbed up the ladder and then reached to the top of the trees. And then it was a little cloudy day, and then scientists showed us his equipment, the device, to measure how tree is making photosynthesis and transpiration. So the equipment for plant physiological equipment has a leaf chamber. So the scientist grabbed a bunch of pine needles and then put it in between the 2 plexiglass, and then it's connected to some kind of measurement devices. And at the time, just the sound started coming out from the crowd. So the needle, the equipment of the needle, from 0 to all of a sudden jumped to very high numbers. All of a sudden, and oh wow, because of the sun started, so the pine started making photosynthesis. And then we said, wow, that's so quick. And then the scientist asked me to put my hand to cover the pine in the plexiglass. So I did it like this. And then immediately the meter, the needle went down. And then it's almost like the tree was reacting to my action. And then it's very simple and then very logical why it happened like that. But we didn't feel like logical. It's almost I'm repeating same things. Tree is reacting to our behavior, and then we really want to chew on this experience. Almost indulging because it's very astonishing, and then it's not. I don't think its intention was to create exactly the same situation, but similar experience and feeling can we create. So that was the origin of the plein air.
What Rick is talking about is important. So, the scientists on that project are basically trying to come up with a scientific model of a forest's carbon response. So they're trying to work at scale. They're trying to come up with general truths that can be backed up by the language and discourse of their discipline. But, what we had was, a subjective transformation where all of a sudden every tree we've ever seen that we perceived as being a seasonal being, slow moving, like the Ents in the Lord of the Rings, they talk real slow, and it's in deep voices. And, and all of a sudden we saw this thing that was just going off, it's incredibly rapid, and it's breathing like we're breathing, but it's, of course, reverse breathing. It's breathing CO2. So that has this moment, an aha moment, which is really important. But it's about where science tries to come up with general truths. I like to think of the arts and humanities as looking at specific truths, but what we began to understand, we started to play with different sensor technologies, was that this was a great excuse to have an intimate interrelationship with things. So part of the use of the sensor technologies and data for us is giving us an excuse to have an intimate long-term relationship with things over time. So we have trees in the front of our flat that we've lived with for over 10 years now. And we hook them up to various devices from time to time and, get a sense of how they're being in the world.
I had one question here to ask you about that kind of relationship between the cultural and the natural in your work. And I mean, it struck me that the deep mapping projects, the kind of earlier projects, were a lot about that as well, about getting at a sense of place, and so sense being the kind of cultural, my sensations of the space, the meanings attributed to the space, and then place, which is, I guess, more of a natural, thing. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the deep mapping projects and about the importance of that relationship between meaning and place, or sensation and place.
Yeah, and nature and culture.
Nature and culture, yeah.
So I guess, as we're thinking about this idea of the plateau and the precipice, it's been interesting, to read through Latour's book about never being modern, and he talks about the purification of modernism, where, science is put over here as something that's pure and analytical and quantitative and separate from the mess over here, which is culture, society, politics. But then he also talks about hybrids that live in the middle, and I think we've become much more of a hybridized world today than we were even 100 years ago. So, from restoration ecology to biogenetic manipulation, it just goes on and on and on. There are lots of different hybrids. So the nature culture question has been held separate for a long time. So Latour gives us one way to understand it, Guattari gives us another way where he's basically talking about the subjectivities, the individual subjectivity, the social subjectivity, the environmental subjectivity, and why these things have to merge to take us, to the other place. And that other place for me is about going off that precipice. It's just about taking the fucking leap, and seeing where you land. So in the deep mapping, deep dialogue efforts, we have a sense, so working on 9 Mile Run and 3 River Second Nature, we knew about those places. Working on the Loughborough bogland site, so the bottom line is this is a really complicated landscape where Ireland, 100 years ago, began to realize, they'd always used peat as a heating source at home and as a cooking source, as an energy source. And around the 1920s, they start to realize they can generate electricity by burning peat. And by 1950, they're building peat-fired power plants. And, Ireland had at that time the best remnant grouping of raised bog lands in Europe. And raised boglands are basically peat that, comes out of a glacial lake and just keeps growing, and it grows like up to 2 stories above the lake. So, these were vast living things upon living things long dead that just kept growing and growing. And this was an incredible harvest. And, so post-war, they're starting to develop the energy process. It's all being industrialized, huge. There's an economy going on. There's rural development going on. And then, of course, you have the oil embargo of the 70s, which then, quickens it all. Everything that was working well up to that point was being refined and reformatted. To the point where by the 1990s, there's a conservation movement that is initiated by discussions with people from the Netherlands who had lost all their boglands, coming into Ireland talking about, what was left. And then a developing understanding that they needed to conserve some of these boglands. And at the same time, they're trying to run the program out, the industrial energy production program, out to its logical ends. So we're invited to come out and take a look at a site that had been extracted to its absolute limit by 1995. They spent 5 years trying to come up with new utilitarian solutions to take it back to agriculture, to take it back to grazing uses. None of it's working. It's hard to grow things on once you've dug it down that far. At which point they go into an amenity process where they invite artists to help create a new form of public space. So that ran from 2000 to 2010. We're brought out in 2019 to look at all of this and try to make sense of it and think about what it might evolve into. Now, it's interesting because there were 10 years of really major commissions where artists were brought in to work with the national extraction team, their technicians and engineers. They developed huge projects, things that an artist could not do on their own. And this is really some significant work. And it's interesting, there's 2 things. So you get this body of work, which if you look at it over time, tracks changing ideas about what those peatlands were. Yeah. So they're a monument to the industrial process and the men that worked on them. They're a material culture that's being transformed in relationship to a natural space. And then it starts to be about the emergent nature that occurs on this site without any human intervention, just stuff that shows up, is starting to have some value for the artists that are coming in. So, we're asked to look at it and ask, what can we do about it? So from our point of view, our role is always about creating a discourse. It's about trying to find things that, excite us, challenge our subjective point of view, but it's also about trying to share those things in some meaningful ways. So, we ended up producing a book, which goes back to, the history of the peatlands before they were being extracted, looks at the industrial technological history of peat extraction, the excitement that was occurring locally. So this is all within a very specific region in the Midlands of Ireland. And then looks at the relationship with the artists and the technicians from Bord na Móna, which is the national company, and then looks at the changing ecological context, the awareness, the emergent awareness of EU regulations, conservation, biodiversity, carbon sequestration, all of these things are in direct conflict with this idea of mining peat, and then suggests ways forward based on artist practices that are more about thinking about a future world that takes some responsibility for climatological change and biodiversity, and so how do you put artists and restoration ecologists together in some meaningful way? When we went there, there are harvest sites that we drove along one 15 minutes, and it's all harvest. And you get out of the car and you look, and as far as you can see, it's just, flat brown earth with piles where they mill it. They take, a few centimeters, then dry it, and then they had train lines that went directly to the power plants. And then directly across the street from there is one of the best remnant raised bogs in the country. And it's interesting, as we started to dig in, there's an ancient religious site on the banks of the River Shannon, and there are historical documents that where the pilgrims talk about walking along the eskers, which are raised banks of glacial debris that lie between these raised mound bogs on both sides as they're starting to walk their way to this religious site for pilgrimage. And it just, the scope and scale of it all just had our attention. And then the other scope and scale that's important is this was one of the first areas that was cut away. So there are thousands of sites that are going to be faced with this question of what is it becoming? What is it? It's no longer nature. It has to be some kind of culture nature. How much, and the restoration community will talk about, re-wetting is one way of sequestering the carbon again. And then, what is the potential for nature to come back? So it's an interesting problematical dialogue. It's interesting because the world's changed radically in the last 20 years. We got involved with GPS and GIS mapping back in Pittsburgh in the 90s. And that was about having one relationship, a ground truth relationship to place, space, and time. Working with scientists, we started to understand, plant species, tree species, and changing ecosystems. But at this point, with climate change really coming on the boil, we've gone from, local systems to regional systems to global systems, to the point where, 99% of the ecologists out there are working off satellite data. So they're going further and further away from a ground truth reality, which tells us about the world, but it's a what does Tim Morton call it, a hyper object? It's a data-based understanding. So as artists, we keep digging in at a relational scale, one-to-one. In some cases, in other cases, we're interested in isolated areas of, you call them ecosystems, you can call them, specific forest and landscapes, boglands and moorlands. But so we're always looking at the specific. The other thing is we're always looking to transform our own subjectivity. So when people ask us why we do art because we're very curious about the world, and we start to dig into a project, and all of a sudden we find something that completely alters what we understand about the world. And we keep digging into that until we fully understand it, then we can make art about it.
So we talked a little bit about the horse darkness. Can you tell me a little bit about that project? Because that's linked to the kind of GPS tracking and mapping project. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. Darkness on his black horse, and we have been taking care of him for 9 years. 2 years we leased him, and then he became ours. And then we visit him once or twice a day just to take care of. Very close, that's what we thought. However, we cannot really spend time with him for 24 hours. That's kind of impossible. He comes to the stable for a few hours, depends on the seasons, but other time he goes back to the field with other horses. So it's very simple idea how to extend our observations, what he's doing in the field. So we just put small, simple GPS unit on his rag. So we documented summer solstices to winter solstices, that period, every night. And then GPS, it's very, simple. So the diagram, the map we got is very hard to understand what is going on. It's just massive dots and then lines. So I needed to trace, and then by tracing to find out what he's doing, and then the simple GPS also shows how long he was at some places. So some places he stops, sometimes longer period, 20 minutes, 40 minutes, or hour. I guess he might be sleeping, or and also sometimes one point to another point. It's so quick and then so straight. Probably he's running. So it's imagination, but we started seeing what he was doing. So that's the project. And then at the same time, we also documented some plant specimens. Horses, people think they eat green grass and then hay. But actually, horses eat many different kind of plants, and then they're like almost like a botanist. They know what to eat, and then when is a good time to eat.
Yeah, so there's more to this than Reiko's admitting. Yeah, so, owning a horse is crazy. We should have never bought a horse. We can't afford it. But, Reiko's fearless. She had the money, she spent it, and she said, we'll figure out how to pay for it month to month. But what we didn't expect was he has a knowledge about place. He's got specific appetites. He's got specific memories. He makes decisions, yeah? So all of these challenge what we think we know about animals, yeah.
In relation to the kind of methodology, it's first, when I go to see Blackwood or Brannock, very old pine trees, or those island vast boglands, or Swanman moss raised bog site, it has feelings. But very hard to describe the feeling. It's not sad or it's not like happy or, maybe poets they could describe. But I don't think it's just one word. It has many kind of intricate feelings. And then, but you hold it. And then, but if you can't say it, how to carry the feeling to other places or other people, or and then if it's a project is involved, we try to find some indications, something it indicates. So the plain air's case is tree, those needles went up or down with the tree, and then the sunlight, and then us. So that was kind of indication. So that's the part I think art is involved. And then so the understanding, the transformation happens, when we understand the other. And the other brings to us things we don't know, we don't own. It's because they are not human. And then begin to small, part of them we begin to understand. Then we started to, carry the understanding. So the transformation and then becoming something else. It was not past me, it's another myself is I am becoming.